Ryan Carter had spent most of his life in places where discipline and order mattered, first in the military, then in private intelligence. So, when he finally decided to settle down in a quiet suburban neighborhood, he wasn't expecting a battlefield. His home sat on the edge of a well-manicured community ruled by an overzealous Homeowners Association, but technically, his property wasn't under their jurisdiction. He had chosen a location precisely because of that. He wanted peace, not bureaucratic nonsense. His car, a sleek, blacked-out Dodge Challenger with a heavily modified engine, sat comfortably in his driveway, a machine that spoke of precision and power. It was his pride and joy, and unlike the sedans and minivans dotting the neighborhood, it stood out. It didn't take long for Karen Whitmore to notice. She was a self-appointed enforcer of the HOA, a middle-aged woman who thrived on controlling every aspect of the community, from the color of people's shutters to the exact length their grass could grow. The first time she appeared at Ryan's doorstep, it was with clipboard in hand, a fake smile plastered across her face, and an air of condescension so thick it nearly suffocated him. "Mr. Carter," she chirped, eyes flicking to his car as though it personally offended her. "I'm here to inform you that vehicles like yours are not permitted in our community." Ryan raised an eyebrow, leaning casually against his doorway. "My house isn't part of your HOA," he pointed out, keeping his voice neutral. Karen smiled and faltered, but a flicker of irritation crossed her face. "Well," she continued, "we like to keep the community aesthetic uniform, and your vehicle, well, it doesn't fit." Ryan let the words hang in the air, his trained instincts picking up on the barely concealed hostility beneath her sugary tone. "That's not my problem," he said simply. Karen's eyes narrowed. "I'll be speaking to the board about this," she said, turning sharply on her heel and striding away, her heels clicking against the pavement. Ryan watched her go, shaking his head. He had encountered power-hungry people before, people who thought they were untouchable, who mistook control for authority. He knew how to handle them. A week later, the notice appeared. An official-looking letter from the HOA, despite the fact that he wasn't a member. The letter cited vague community regulations and demanded that he either remove or relocate his vehicle within 48 hours or face fines. Ryan chuckled as he read it. Fines? He didn't even pay HOA fees. What exactly were we going to fine him for? He tossed the letter into the trash and went about his day. Karen, however, wasn't done. The next morning, he stepped outside to find her standing beside his car, arms crossed, flanked by two other HOA members. "Mr. Carter," she greeted, her voice edged with forced politeness. "You seem to have ignored our notice." Ryan exhaled, suppressing his irritation. "I didn't ignore it. I dismissed it." The two HOA members shifted uncomfortably, but Karen remained steadfast. "I don't think you understand how things work here," she said, tilting her chin up. "If you refuse to comply, we will be forced to take further action." Ryan smirked. "Oh, and what exactly do you think you can do?" Her lips pursed, and for a brief moment, she seemed at a loss. Then a slow smile spread across her face, and she pulled out her phone. "If you won't listen to reason, perhaps law enforcement will get through to you." It was an empty threat, at least Ryan assumed it was, until he saw the police cruiser pull up to his house 20 minutes later. Two uniformed officers stepped out, their faces unreadable as they approached. "Sir, we received a report about an abandoned vehicle," one of them said, glancing at the Challenger. Ryan folded his arms, forcing himself to remain calm. "That's my car. It's parked in my driveway." Karen stood smugly to the side, arms folded, watching the scene unfold with satisfaction. "Sir," the officer continued, his voice professional but firm, "we need to verify ownership and ensure it's not a nuisance to the neighborhood." Ryan reached into his pocket, pulling out his ID and vehicle registration. "Everything's in order," he said, handing them over. The officer glanced over the documents, his expression shifting slightly. "Former military?" he asked, noting the designation on Ryan's ID. Ryan nodded. "Yeah, spent years in intelligence. I know the law pretty well." The officer exchanged a glance with his partner, then turned to Karen. "Ma'am, this vehicle is legally parked on private property. There's no violation here." Karen's face turned red. "But it doesn't belong here." It's an eyesore, and it violates our HOA regulations. He's not part of your HOA, the officer pointed out. You have no authority over him or his property. Karen's mouth opened and closed, struggling for a response. There must be something you can do, she finally snapped. I mean, look at it. The officer sighed, clearly losing patience. Ma'am, you called us out for a legal, registered vehicle parked on private property. If you continue making false reports, you could be charged with filing a false complaint. The color drained from Karen's face. Well, this is absurd. She turned sharply to Ryan. You think this is over? She hissed. You have no idea who you're messing with. Ryan chuckled, crossing his arms. Funny, I was about to say the same to you. Karen stormed off, practically vibrating with anger, but Ryan knew she wasn't going to let it go. People like her never did. He had dealt with far more dangerous adversaries in his career, and he recognized the look in her eyes. This wasn't just about the car anymore. This was about control. And Karen Whitmore was about to learn a very painful lesson about picking battles she couldn't win. Ryan had faced powerful enemies before, military leaders with unchecked authority, warlords who ruled through fear, and intelligence operatives who could disappear off the grid in an instant. Karen Whitmore, with a suburban dictatorship and a clipboard full of outdated HOA bylaws, was nowhere near that level. But what she lacked in real power, she made up for with sheer audacity. The police visit had been her first move, a weak attempt to strong-arm him into submission. Now that it had failed, Ryan knew she was going to escalate. People like Karen didn't back down when they lost. They doubled down, digging in their heels, convinced that if they just pushed hard enough, they could get their way. And Karen had the added disadvantage of not knowing exactly who she was dealing with. The first sign of her next move came the following morning. Ryan opened his mailbox to find another letter, this one more aggressive than the last. It was another violation notice from the HOA, listing made-up infractions: excessive noise, failure to maintain property aesthetics, and parking violations. It ended with a demand: either comply with community standards or face legal action. Ryan smirked as he read it. Legal action? Against someone who wasn't even part of the HOA? That was a bold strategy. He grabbed his coffee, sat down at his kitchen table, and did what he did best. He started digging. Within an hour, he had the HOA's financial records pulled up through public filings. He cross-referenced their expenditures with the dues collected, noting a discrepancy. A big one. A few $1,000s missing here and there over the past several years, cleverly disguised as administrative expenses. But Ryan had seen this pattern before. It was embezzlement. And Karen, as the president of the HOA, was right at the center of it. That afternoon, he decided to test the waters. He walked straight to Karen's house and knocked. It took her a moment, but when she opened the door, she was already scowling. "What do you want?" she snapped. Ryan held up the letter. "Got your notice," he said casually. "Just wanted to let you know that none of this applies to me. Also, I took a look at your HOA's financials. Interesting numbers." Karen stiffened. "Excuse me?" "You know," Ryan continued, "some pretty glaring inconsistencies. Thousands of dollars unaccounted for. Makes me wonder where it's all going." Karen's face paled for just a moment before she regained her composure. "You have no right to snoop through our finances," she hissed. "Actually," Ryan said, pulling a folded document from his pocket, "since your HOA is a registered nonprofit, these records are public. I have every right." He watched as Karen clench her jaw. "I suggest you drop this, Mr. Carter. You're making a big mistake." Ryan tilted his head, amused. "Is that a threat?" Karen didn't answer, slamming the door in his face instead. Ryan knew that was only going to provoke her further. Sure enough, the retaliation came swiftly. Within days, he began noticing things. A neighbor who had been friendly suddenly stopped waving at him. Another crossed the street when he approached. Karen had been working behind the scenes, spreading rumors, manipulating the community, trying to isolate him. It was a classic move, turn the neighborhood against the outsider. But Ryan had seen this play before, and he was already 10 steps ahead. He spent his evenings talking to other homeowners, asking questions, listening. The more he learned, the clearer the pattern became. Karen had bullied people for years, enforcing rules inconsistently, finding those who opposed her while ignoring violations from those loyal to her, even pressuring homeowners into costly mandatory upgrades that conveniently benefited her own contracting business. There were plenty of people who hated her, but they had been too afraid to push back. Ryan wasn't afraid. Then things took a darker turn. One night, just after midnight, Ryan heard a noise outside. He checked the security cameras and saw a figure lurking near his car. He slipped out the back, moving silently, years of training making his footsteps undetectable. As he rounded the corner, he caught the intruder, a young man, probably in his early 20s, wearing a hoodie and gloves. The guy was attempting to slash his tires. "Need help?" Ryan's voice was calm, almost amused. The would-be vandal yelped, stumbling backward. "Stay back, man." Ryan smirked. "Why don't you tell me who sent you first?" The kid hesitated, then bolted. Ryan let him go, knowing the security footage would be enough. The next morning, he forwarded the video to the local police, along with a note. "Nice try, Karen." Karen, of course, denied everything, but she was getting desperate. The HOA board, which had once stood firmly behind her, was beginning to waver. The financial discrepancies were causing unrest, and Ryan made sure to stoke the flames. He printed out financial reports and slipped them under doors. He had quiet conversations with homeowners, strategically planting seeds of doubt. The final straw came when Ryan uncovered a direct payment from the HOA's account to a company owned by Karen's nephew, money that was supposed to go toward neighborhood maintenance. It was blatant fraud, and now Ryan had everything he needed. By the end of the week, an emergency HOA meeting was called. Ryan didn't bother to attend at first. He had already set the wheels in motion, but halfway through, he received a text from a neighbor. "You might want to come. She's unraveling." When he arrived, the scene was glorious. Karen stood at the front of the room, red-faced and shouting, while a group of homeowners confronted her with paperwork. "This is slander," she shrieked. "I have done nothing wrong." "Then explain this." One homeowner demanded, holding up a document linking Karen to the missing funds. The crowd murmured, the tide turning against her. Ryan stepped forward then, leaning casually against the doorway. "Karen," he drawled, "you should probably call a lawyer." She spun toward him, eyes blazing with hatred. "You," she hissed. "You did this." Ryan shrugged. "You did this to yourself." Karen's last act of defiance was to claim she had been framed, that she was a victim of a vendetta, that Ryan had hacked her records. But no one was buying it. The police arrived an hour later, and while she wasn't arrested on the spot, an investigation was officially opened. The look on her face as she realized her empire was crumbling was almost satisfying. Almost. Ryan knew there was still one more chapter left in this war. Ryan Carter had spent years dismantling criminal organizations, unraveling conspiracies, and dealing with some of the most ruthless individuals in the world. He had seen people cling to power with every ounce of strength they had, convinced they were invincible. Karen Whitmore was no different. Even as the walls closed in around her, as the community turned against her, as the HOA board distanced themselves from her corruption, she refused to accept defeat. But Ryan knew better. He had seen this before. People like Karen never went quietly. The fallout from the emergency HOA meeting was immediate. Karen's usual allies on the board had been forced into damage control mode, desperately trying to save their own reputations. Some resigned outright, hoping to avoid being implicated in the financial scandal that was now a matter of public record. Others tried to pretend they had no idea what had been happening. But the evidence Ryan had uncovered was damning. The missing money, the falsified maintenance contracts, the secret payouts to Karen's relatives. It was all there in black and white. The homeowners, who had once been too afraid to challenge her, were now demanding accountability. Karen, of course, wasn't going down without a fight. The first sign of her desperation came the morning after the meeting. Ryan stepped outside to grab his mail and found a letter taped to his front door. Unlike the official-looking HOA notices she had sent before, this one was handwritten in shaky, furious script. "You think you've won? You have no idea who you're dealing with. I will make sure you regret this." Ryan smirked, pocketing the note. A threat? After everything that had happened, this was the best she could do? He had dealt with far worse. But Karen wasn't just trying to intimidate him. She was still trying to manipulate the situation in her favor. Over the next few days, she worked behind the scenes, calling in favors, trying to rally the few remaining neighbors who still supported her. She even attempted to convince law enforcement that she was the victim of a targeted smear campaign. But it was too late. The police had already begun their own investigation, and the more they looked, the worse things got for her. One of the board members, in a desperate bid to save himself, provided a written statement detailing Karen's history of misusing funds and strong-arming residents into compliance. Another former HOA president came forward with a similar story. Karen had pulled the same scams in a previous neighborhood before being quietly removed from her position. The pattern was undeniable. She wasn't just a power-hungry HOA president. She was a grifter, hopping from one community to the next, embedding herself in positions of authority and bleeding the homeowners dry. And now, she was out of time. The final blow came when Ryan, using his contacts in law enforcement, uncovered something even more damning. Karen had been filing fraudulent tax documents for the HOA, underreporting income and pocketing the difference. That was federal fraud, and it came with serious consequences. The day she was arrested, Ryan stood on his front porch, sipping his coffee as a police cruiser pulled up to her house. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalks, whispering as the officers knocked on her door. Karen answered, still wearing the same air of superiority she always had. But when they informed her that she was under investigation for fraud, extortion, and misuse of funds, her confidence cracked. "This is ridiculous," she screeched. "I am the victim here." The officers remained impassive as they explained the charges. When they moved to cuff her, she pulled back. "You can't do this. I'll sue all of you." Ryan chuckled to himself as he watched the scene unfold. Even now, she couldn't accept reality. As they escorted her to a patrol car, she caught sight of him standing there, watching. Her eyes burned with hatred. "This is your fault," she spat. "You ruined everything." Ryan simply raised his coffee cup in a mock toast. "Have a nice day, Karen." The officers placed her in the back of the car, and the moment the door shut, the neighborhood erupted into quiet cheers. It wasn't just about the money or the corruption. It was about freedom. For the first time in years, the community was free from Karen's grip. In the weeks that followed, the HOA was completely restructured. A new board was elected, one that was actually interested in serving the community rather than exploiting it. The ridiculous fines and rules that Karen had enforced were overturned. And as for Ryan, he became something of a legend in the neighborhood. The man who took down Karen Whitmore. It wasn't the kind of battle he had expected when he moved here, but in the end, it had been a battle worth fighting. Karen, of course, tried to fight the charges, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. The last Ryan heard, she had taken a plea deal, avoiding prison time in exchange for full restitution, and a lifetime ban from holding any HOA position again. It was a fitting end. As Ryan stood in his driveway, looking at his perfectly parked car, the same car Karen had tried so hard to get rid of, he smiled. Some battles weren't fought on the battlefield. Some were fought on quiet suburban streets, against enemies who wielded nothing more than a clipboard and an overinflated sense of power. And sometimes the best way to win was simply by refusing to back down.